The grand crystalline hall of the Zierthal Empire stretched out like an endless dream made of glass and light. The ceiling rose so high that clouds seemed to form inside the building itself, and the walls glowed with a soft blue energy that pulsed like the heartbeat of some giant sleeping creature. Commander James Mitchell stood in the center of this magnificent space, wearing his dress uniform with the Earth Coalition insignia on his chest. He was a tall human man with dark hair and kind eyes, but compared to the towering alien figures around him, he looked like a child lost in a forest of giants. The Zierthal were beautiful, in a way that made humans uncomfortable to look at for too long. Their skin shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between purple and silver, depending on how the light caught them. Their bodies were elegant and graceful, each with long limbs that moved with mechanical precision. Their faces were sharp and angular, with large eyes that glowed faintly, like someone had placed two small moons in their skulls. For thousands of years, they had ruled their galaxy with absolute logic and perfect order. They saw emotion as a weakness and had trained themselves to feel nothing at all. They were superior. They believed, and they showed this by keeping their faces blank and their voices flat. Jim had been sent here as an ambassador for the United Human Coalition. It was his job to represent humanity and to help negotiate trade agreements and peace treaties. The Zierthal were not hostile to humans, but they were also not particularly interested in them. They saw humans as curious animals that had somehow learned to build spaceships, but lacked the superior intellect and emotional and control that made the Zierthal truly great. Jim tried not to let this bother him. He knew that first contact with advanced civilizations was always challenging. The grand ceremony was being held to celebrate a trade agreement. The Queen herself would be present along with her entire court and the most important nobles and military leaders from across the Zierthal worlds. Jim stood in a line with other dignitaries from various alien species, each waiting for their moment to approach the Queen. The line moved slowly, and Jim had time to observe the alien courtiers around him. They spoke in voices that sounded like wind chimes, but their words were always logical and measured. Nothing about them suggested joy or sorrow or anger. They were beings of pure reason. Then Jim saw her Princess Velara walked into the hall, and Jim understood for the first time why the Zierthal had such confidence in their perfection. She was extraordinary. Even more beautiful than the other Zierthal, her movements were so graceful they seemed like dance, even though her face showed no emotion. Her eyes glowed brighter than others, and her skin had a deeper, more vibrant color. She wore robes made of what looked like liquid starlight that flowed around her as she moved. The Queen followed her closely, and Jim realized that Velara was clearly important and clearly favored. The ceremony continued, and Jim eventually came to bow before the Queen. The Queen looked at him with those glowing eyes and made a small gesture that he understood meant he was dismissed. He backed away and took his place standing to the side of the hall. He tried to blend into the background and observe, but something caught his attention. Princess Velara was not looking well. Jim noticed it slowly at first, just a small thing. A slight sway to her posture, a dimming of her luminescent eyes. But then it became more obvious. She would stand still for a moment, then sway slightly, then catch herself. She would place one elegant hand against her side as if something hurt, but her face showed nothing. That was the strangest part. Her expression remained completely calm and blank, even though clearly something was wrong with her physically. Jim was not a doctor, but he had received basic medical training as part of his ambassador preparation. He recognized the signs of someone who was sick. The way she was breathing was not quite right. The way she held her body suggested pain or discomfort, but the Zierthal around her seemed to notice nothing, or perhaps they did notice, but considered it beneath their notice to acknowledge it in any way. The ceremony went on. The Queen made a speech in the musical wind chime language of the Zierthal. Though Jim did not understand the words, the meaning seemed clear. It was about tradition, about the superiority of logic, about the eternal rule of the Zierthal over their corner of the galaxy. Jim found himself watching Princess Velara instead of paying attention to the speech. She swayed again, and this time, she did not recover. Her eyes seemed to lose focus. Her knees bent slightly, and Jim saw what was happening. She was going to fall. Jim moved without thinking. He pushed through the crowd with the strength that his human muscles possessed. Something that surprised the nearby aliens who expected him to move with less power. He reached out as Velara collapsed and caught her in his arms. The princess was light, almost insubstantial and warm to the touch, much warmer than she should have been. For a moment, everything in the grand crystalline hall froze. The gasps came from all around. The sharp intake of breath from beings who had been trained for generations not to show emotion was shocking in itself. But the real shock was what Jim had done. He was holding the queen's daughter. He had his arms around her. He was cradling her head against his shoulder in a gesture of comfort and care. An alien guard took a step forward, but the queen raised one slender hand, and the guard stopped immediately. The queen looked at Jim with an expression that he could not quite read. Even with her blank face, he thought he saw something moving behind those glowing eyes, something that might have been curiosity or concern, or perhaps both. Jim looked down at the princess in his arms and felt her skin. His hand registered the fever immediately. This was not just weakness or a simple faint. The girl was burning up with heat. Her body was fighting something serious. The queen moved toward them slowly, and Jim realized he should probably let go, that he had probably made a serious mistake. But before he could move, the queen reached down and gently touched her daughter's forehead. She held her hand there for a long moment, and when she withdrew it, her hand was shaking slightly. That small shake was the first sign that perhaps the Zierthal were not as emotionless as they seemed. Jim sat in the medical wing of the royal palace, and the hours seemed to stretch like pulled taffy. Each moment felt like it lasted forever, and yet time also seemed to move too fast. He had been ordered to remain with the princess while she recovered, though no one had explained to him exactly why this was necessary. The royal physicians had examined Velara thoroughly, and their conclusion was strange and troubling. She was suffering from a condition that should not exist in the Zierthal species. The head physician, a tall alien named Krell, with eyes that glowed more brightly than others, explained the situation to Jim and the queen in careful, measured tones. The princess had experienced what he called an emotional system collapse. It was a rare condition that occurred in Zierthal who had been forced to suppress their feelings for too long. The biological systems that normally managed emotional expression were failing. The more she suppressed, the more she suffered until eventually her body simply shut down. The queen listened to this explanation, and Jim thought he saw something. A flicker in her eyes, that same something he had seen when she touched her daughter's fevered head. He wondered if perhaps the queen understood this condition in a personal way. The treatment was unusual. The physicians said that what Velara needed was emotional stimulation and genuine human contact. They explained that something about the authenticity of human feeling might trigger her body to remember how to process emotions herself. The Zierthal had forgotten how to heal their own kind because they had forgotten that emotions were a natural part of being alive. The human presence might help wake that part of her up. This was how Jim found himself sitting in a comfortable chair beside the sleeping princess night after night, talking to her about things that probably seemed completely strange to an alien princess who had never experienced. A genuine feeling. He told her about Earth, about the rain that fell from the sky, and how it felt on skin. He told her about music, about the way a single song could make a human cry or laugh or want to dance in the street. He told her about his family. His mother had died when he was young, and he talked about how much it hurt to lose her, but also how beautiful it was that he had loved her at all. He talked about his brother who made him laugh, and his sister who he sometimes wanted to strangle but would protect with his own life. He talked about these relationships with all their complications and contradictions, and the strange beauty that came from truly feeling connected to other people. The princess slept, but Jim kept talking. He was not sure if she could hear him, but the physicians encouraged him to continue. They monitored her vital signs, and carefully and reported that she seemed to respond to the sound of his voice. Her heart rate would become more regular when he spoke. Her body would seem to relax slightly, as if she was listening from somewhere deep inside her sleeping mind. Jim also sang to her, which probably sounded terrible. He did not have a beautiful voice. It was rough and sometimes went off key, but it came from genuine feeling, and somehow that seemed to matter more than technical skill. He sang old songs from Earth, songs about love and loss and hope. He sang songs about home and family and the desire to find connection with other people. The attending physicians seemed scandalized by this behavior. They would stand at the edges of the room, with their glowing eyes fixed on Jim in expressions of confusion. They were not sure what to make of a human who was so freely expressing emotion in the presence of royalty. But they did not stop him because the Queen had ordered that Jim should be given complete freedom to care for her daughter in whatever way he saw fit. Days passed, and slowly Velara began to improve. Her fever decreased, her body relaxed more as she slept. Then something even more remarkable happened. Other Zierthal in the palace began to change subtly. At first, then more noticeably, Jim would notice courtiers looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were feeling something. A slight curve to a mouth that might have been an attempted smile, a tremor in a voice that might have indicated emotion, a hesitation in movement that suggested uncertainty instead of perfect logical control. The Queen began visiting more frequently. She would sit beside her daughter and hold her hand, and something, and in the way she held that hand, suggested care, suggested maternal love, suggested that perhaps she too had been suppressing feelings all these years. A crack was forming in the wall of emotionless perfection that the Zierthal had built. But not everyone was happy about these changes. In the darker sections of the palace, ancient nobles who had lived for centuries began to gather. They spoke in urgent whispers about the danger of infection, about how the human presence was corrupting their perfect society. They called it an emotional contagion, something that spread like disease through the orderly ranks of Zierthal civilization. They argued that the princess needed to be isolated, that the human needed to be removed, and that the Queen needed to remember her duty to tradition. These nobles had lived so long in their emotionless state that they had forgotten that emotions had ever been important. They saw the changes happening in the palace as a catastrophe. They blamed Jim for introducing weakness into their bloodlines, Jim for reminding them of things they had worked very hard to forget. They met in secret chambers and made plans. Plans that involved removing the threat. Plans that involved someone dying. One night, as Jim slept in a small room adjacent to Velara's chamber, the old nobles made their first move. They sent an assassin, someone skilled in the old ways, someone who had been trained to kill without hesitation, without mercy, without any emotion at all. The assassin moved through the palace corridors like a shadow, but the Queen had guards loyal to her placed throughout the halls, and somehow these guards seemed to know something was wrong. They moved to intercept the assassin. They fought in the corridors, and the assassin was captured before reaching Jim's room. The Queen knew then that the conflict was no longer small. It was no longer just about a sick princess and a human who cared for her. It was about the future of her entire civilization. The royal gardens of the Zierthal Palace were unlike anything Jim had ever seen on Earth. They contained plants that glowed with bioluminescent light, plants that moved and danced without any wind, plants that sang in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing. Jim sat on a stone bench that was warm to the touch and watched the alien plants with wonder. Never noticing the figure approaching him from behind, Velara moved silently through the gardens the way she had been trained to move since childhood, with perfect control and absolute precision. But there was something different about her now, something that had not been present before. She was awake, and she had been awake for 3 days. Now she could finally walk without assistance. She could finally leave the medical wing without the concerned faces of the physicians hovering around her. Jim did not hear her until she spoke. Her voice was musical, like the sound of wind chimes, but different from other Zierthal voices. There was something new in it, something that Jim recognized as curiosity. He turned and saw her standing a few feet away in her formal robes that glowed softly in the light of the bioluminescent plants. She was beautiful, and for a moment, Jim felt something he had not expected to feel. Velara approached him slowly and sat beside him on the stone bench. Their shoulders were not quite touching, but Jim was very aware of how close she was. The princess looked out at the gardens the same way Jim had been looking at them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Velara turned to face him, and Jim saw tears in her eyes. They were small, tears barely visible, but they were definitely there. Tears were something that Zierthal very rarely produced. It was another aspect of their emotional suppression. But Velara was crying, and she did not seem to be trying to hide it. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet garden. "Why did you catch me when I fell? You could have simply let me fall. You could have stepped away. Why would you risk yourself for someone you do not know?" Jim thought about this question carefully. He tried to explain something that he had always taken for granted about being human. He said that humans were creatures who felt compassion almost automatically. When someone was hurting, when someone needed help, the natural instinct was to reach out to help them, not because of logic or calculation, but because of something deeper, something that came from the heart. Velara listened, and her eyes grew brighter as she listened, as if she was processing something important for the first time in her long life. She reached out slowly, giving Jim time to pull away if he wanted to. She took his hand and held it gently. Her skin was cool now, no longer fevered, but still warm to the touch. "I have never felt anything before," she said softly. "For my entire life, I was taught that feeling was weakness, that emotion was illogical, that the highest form of existence was to think without feeling, to act without caring. But when you held me, when you talked to me while I slept, I felt something. I felt safe. I felt cared for. I felt something I do not have a word for in my language, but in human language, I think the word is gratitude." Jim squeezed her hand gently, and Velara looked at him with wonder in her eyes. She was experiencing something new, something that the Zierthal had trained out of their species over thousands of years. She was feeling connection, but their peaceful moment in the gardens did not last. That night, guards came to Jim's quarters and took him to meet with the Queen in a private chamber. The Queen looked more troubled than he had ever seen her, and Jim realized that even beings of pure logic could feel fear when they cared deeply about something. The conspiracy had been exposed. A group of ancient nobles had been meeting in secret. They saw Jim and the changes he was bringing as a threat to their civilization. They did not want their carefully ordered, odd world disrupted by emotion and irrationality. There had already been an assassination attempt, and there would be more. The Queen warned him that his life was now in danger. Jim felt the weight of this knowledge settle on his shoulders. He had come to the Zierthal expecting a simple diplomatic mission. Instead, he had become the center of a revolution that he had never intended to start. The ancient nobles were gathering allies. They were preparing to move against the Queen. They were preparing to remove the threat that was Jim Mitchell, and in doing so, they would remove Velara as well. That night, as Jim tried to sleep, he felt a strange sensation. It was like something pulling at his mind. He remembered that the Zierthal had a technology, a neural network that connected their minds in subtle ways. He realized with some alarm that Velara was trying to reach him through this network. He had never imagined that a human could access such a network, but apparently Velara had modified it somehow to make it possible. In the darkness of his mind, he heard her voice clear and pure and full of emotion. "They are coming for you." "Jim," she was urgent and frightened. "Something inside the palace is wrong. Danger is moving toward you. I can feel it through the network. I can feel the intention to harm." Jim woke immediately, alert and ready. He moved quickly through the corridors toward the guard stations. He did not know exactly where danger was coming from, but he trusted Velara. He trusted the connection they had formed. The assassins came from 3 directions at once. But Jim was faster than they expected, and the Queen's loyal guards were waiting. Guards moved to intercept, and a fight broke out in the palace. Corridors, blasters fired, and energy weapons lit up the darkness. Jim was caught in the middle, but he was not seriously injured. When the dust cleared and the guards had subdued the attackers, Jim understood something important. Velara had saved his life. She had risked using the neural network to warn him. She had exposed herself to danger to protect him. The princess, who had never felt emotion, had just demonstrated that she felt something very powerful indeed. When Jim made his way back to Velara's chambers, he found her standing at her window looking out at the lights of the city. She turned when he entered, and he saw that her eyes were glowing very brightly. "I felt fear," she said simply. "Fear for you? I understand now why humans feel so much. You feel so strongly because what you value matters so much to you." Velara moved closer to Jim, and something in that moment changed. The princess and the human were no longer just a diplomatic curiosity and a sick alien girl. They were 2 people who had connected across the vast distance of their species and found something real and true. Behind them in the shadows, the ancient nobles were watching, and they were making final preparations to strike. The Galactic Parliament Chamber was the largest room Jim had ever seen. It stretched out like an endless hall with seats arranged in a massive circle. Each seat was occupied by a representative from the important Zirthal worlds. Thousands of glowing eyes looked down from the galleries above. All of them focused on the Queen as she stepped forward to give an address that would change everything. Jim stood beside her with Velara on his other side. The 3 of them formed a strange group, a human and two Zirthal, standing together before the representatives of an entire civilization. That alone was remarkable. But what the Queen was about to say would be far more remarkable. The Queen began her speech, and her voice carried through the chamber, amplified by technology, so that every being present could hear her clearly. She spoke about history, about a time thousands of years ago when the Zirthal were different from what they were now. She spoke about a war, a terrible war that had nearly destroyed their entire species in those ancient days. During that war, the Zirthal had discovered that emotion made soldiers weak. It made them hesitate. It made them feel fear and doubt. So they had begun a program to suppress emotion, to train it out of themselves gradually over generations. The program was meant to be temporary, just until the war ended, until they had achieved peace and safety. But the temporary measures became permanent. The emotional suppression became doctrine, became law, became the very foundation of Zirthal civilization. But the Queen explained there had been a cost, a terrible cost. She spoke of population decline. They had thought the low birth rates were simply a natural consequence of their advanced civilization. But the truth was darker. Zirthal who could not feel, could not bond with each other. Not really. They could not love. Each new generation was born, but fewer and fewer children appeared in the birthing centers. The species was slowly dying. They just had not admitted it to themselves. She spoke of cultural stagnation. All their art had become logical and cold. All their music was mathematical and precise. All their literature contained nothing but facts and theories. And there was no beauty, no passion, no reason to celebrate simply being alive. The great achievements of their people were in the distant past. Now they simply maintained what had come before, without ever creating anything new. She spoke of souls withering. She used that exact phrase, and when the Zirthal heard the Queen speak of souls, something moved through the Parliament chamber, something that might have been recognition, or maybe regret, or maybe hope. Then the Queen presented evidence that Jim had been studying throughout his time on the Zirthal world. He stepped forward with data, showing the parallel between human emotional expression and human progress, showing how civilizations that felt deeply also created the most beautiful art, the most profound science, the most meaningful connections between people. The Queen was not saying that The Zirthal were inferior. She was saying that they were incomplete. She called on them to make a choice, a gradual, careful choice to relearn what they had forgotten, to reintegrate emotion into their civilization, not recklessly but thoughtfully, not destroying logic but balancing it with feeling not as opposites, but as partners. She pointed to her daughter and said that Velara was proof that change was possible, that the Zirthal could feel and think at the same time. They did not have to choose between the two. The parliament erupted, but it was not with anger. At first there was silence, then whispers, then something more. The representatives began to speak openly. Some supported the Queen enthusiastically, but others were horrified. They saw this proposal as a betrayal of everything the Zirthal had built over the past thousands of years. A traditionalist faction rose up led by Council Lord Meridar, a Zirthal so ancient that his skin had begun to turn a pale gray. He denounced the Queen. He called her a traitor to her own kind. He said that this human had poisoned her mind, that the princess was sick and corrupted, that the only solution was to restore the old ways through any means necessary. But then something happened that nobody expected. A young Zirthal military commander named Tal stood up in the parliament. His voice shook as he began to speak for the first time in his long life. He was going to admit something that he had never admitted to anyone else. In the ancient war that the Queen had mentioned, he had a brother. His brother was killed in that war. And for thousands of years, Tal had carried the weight of that loss. He had suppressed it because suppression was what the people did. But now he could not suppress it anymore. The commander began to cry, and the parliament fell silent, because a Zirthal crying was like seeing gravity reverse, like watching the sun move across the sky backward. It was a sign that the fundamental order of their universe was changing. Tal spoke of his grief. He spoke of all the feelings he had locked away for generations. He spoke of how tired he was, of not feeling anything. He spoke of looking at younger Zirthal and wondering if they would ever know joy or love or the simple pleasure of connection. And when he finished speaking, he was not alone. Other Zirthal stood up. Some were crying. Some were shaking visibly, some were simply looking at each other with confusion and wonder, as if they were experiencing emotion for the first time in their very long lives. The emotional dam had broken. But in that same moment, in the depths of the palace, far from the parliament chamber, the ancient nobles made their move. They arrested the Queen. They arrested guards loyal to her. They moved through the palace with military precision, using forces they had secretly been gathering. Forces that even the Queen did not know about. They were launching a coup. They were going to overthrow the Queen and restore the old ways through force. They were going to arrest Jim and execute him. They were going to prove that emotion was weakness by destroying everyone who embraced it. Jim felt the shift through Velara. She was connected to the palace systems through the neural network, and she alerted him immediately. They had to run. They had to find a way to escape the palace before the ancient nobles could capture them. The Queen had been right about one. A thing Jim realized as he and Velara ran through the corridors. The human heart might be small compared to the vast machinery of a galactic civilization, but it was powerful. It contained strength that logic alone could never achieve. And now that strength was being tested, the broadcasting center was located at the highest point of the capital city. Jim and Velara ran through the streets with the sounds of conflict echoing behind them. The coup had begun, and already fighting had broken out in the palace corridors. Loyal forces and rebel forces clashed in desperate battles, but the outcome was still uncertain. Velara knew every route through the city, every hidden passage, every alternative path, because she had spent her entire life in this place. Jim followed her, trusting that she knew what she was doing. His lungs burned from running, and his human body felt the strain, but he kept moving. He kept running toward hope. They reached the broadcasting center, and Velara used her royal credentials to override the security systems. The old guards at the entrance recognized her and stepped aside. They had seen the changes happening in the city. They had felt the stirrings of emotion in their own repressed hearts, and they were not ready to fight to preserve the old ways anymore. Inside the center, Jim helped Velara to a communication chair, an interface that would allow her voice to reach every screen, every communication device, every home, on every Zierthal world. The ancient nobles had not thought to secure this place. They had not expected anyone to be bold enough to try this. They had assumed their superior logic made them unbeatable, but they had not accounted for the power of emotion. They had not accounted for the human heart. Velara activated the system, and her image appeared on every screen across the Zierthal civilization. For the first time ever, a member of the royal family was going to speak to the people not as their superior, but as one of them, as a person. Her voice was clear as she began to speak. She told them about her collapse and about the fever that had nearly killed her. She told them about Jim and what he had done for her, someone she was before they met. She told them about waking up and feeling emotion for the first time in her entire life. She described the strange, overwhelming sensation of caring about another being. She told them the truth about their civilization. She told them that their ancestors had done something to themselves, something that was meant to be temporary, something that had never been meant to. They last thousands of years, she told them that their species was dying slowly, quietly, under the weight of endless suppression and logic without feeling. She spoke directly to the deepest heart of each Zierthal listening. She said that she understood why they were afraid. She said that she had been afraid too when she first began to feel. But she said that fear was part of the package. It came with joy and love and connection and purpose. It came with meaning. Then she told them about their king, her father. She said that when he had been ill, their mother had suffered as well, but he could not feel her pain. He could not grieve when she was in danger. He could not feel the urgency of her suffering because emotion had been trained out of him. She said that if he had been able to feel, maybe he would have fought harder to survive. Maybe he would have had a reason to want to live beyond pure logic. She said that the ancient nobles had let entire populations suffer in silence because they deemed suffering illogical. They had turned away from pain as if ignoring it made it go away. But pain was a signal that something mattered. Pain meant that something was important enough to hurt about. She asked them if they wanted to live in a world where nothing mattered, where nothing was important, where everything was empty and cold. Her broadcast ended with a simple statement. She said that she was choosing to feel. She was choosing to love. She was choosing emotion over endless logic, and she was inviting all of them to make that same choice. What happened next was something the ancient nobles had never anticipated. In cities across the Zierthal worlds, people began to gather in the streets. They did not gather silently. They did not gather with blank faces. They gathered and they sang. They gathered and they wept. They gathered and they embraced each other. Some of them had memories of emotion from their distant past. Some of them were feeling something for the first time ever. But all of them were responding to something true and real that Velara had said. The military forces that had been positioned to support the coup saw the people in the streets. They saw the emotion. There was no violence in those crowds, no threat, just beings choosing to feel. The soldiers looked at each other and made a choice. They refused to fire on civilians expressing joy and sorrow. They refused to continue supporting the ancient nobles. The coup collapsed without bloodshed. In the palace, the queen was released. She walked free from the chambers where she had been held, and I found her loyal guards removing the ancient nobles from power. The traditionalists tried to resist, but without military support and without the people backing them, they were helpless. They were arrested and confined to face trial for their crimes. The queen made her way to the broadcasting center, and when she arrived, she found Jim and Velara standing together looking out at the city. Lights were beginning to appear in homes across the civilization, places where Zierthal were sharing moments together. Families were connecting in ways they had not connected in thousands of years. Music was playing in the streets, something that had almost been forgotten. Art was being created without calculation or logic, but purely from the heart. Months passed, and the transformation continued. Slowly at first, then faster, the Zierthal began to reclaim what they had. They established exchange programs with human civilizations. Jim stayed on the Zirthal world and became an unofficial ambassador of emotion, teaching the Zirthal about art and music and literature and the meaning of connection. One evening, Jim and Velara stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Jim saw Velara lean against him. In the early days of their friendship, this would have been unthinkable. Now it was natural and beautiful. She rested her head on his shoulder and they stood together watching the world they had helped to change. "Your kind saved ours," Velara said softly after a long silence. Jim smiled and shook his head. "No," he said. "Your willingness to feel saved yourselves. I just reminded you what you were capable of. I just caught a princess when she fell and refused to let go." Below them, the city glowed with new light. New art galleries were opening. New music theaters were being built. The libraries were filling with stories and poetry and songs. The Zirthal were learning to be alive in ways they had forgotten to be. Emotion and logic were learning to work together, neither destroying the other but making each other stronger. The human had come to an advanced civilization and saved them not with weapons or superior technology, but with something far more powerful. He had given them back their hearts. He had reminded them that to feel was not weakness, but strength. The greatest strength of all. As the two figures stood together on the balcony looking out at the transformed world, a new age was beginning. An age where logic and emotion could exist together, where beauty and truth could both be honored, where the Zirthal could finally be complete.